Today we are reflecting on the incredible life of Eddie Jordan, who sadly passed away today at the age of 76 after an amazing life in Formula One. Joining me for our chat today is former chief sports writer of the Irish Independent, Vincent Hogan. Vincent, thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure, Will.
And Vincent, it's hard to sum up the man that was Eddie Jordan, the life he led, throughout his incredible tenure in Formula One with Jordan Racing. I know you covered him going back even before that, when he was kind of on the initial rungs of that ladder. How would you sum up, I suppose, the place he had in Irish sport, in global sport, when he was really operating at the height of his powers?
Well, first thing I'd say, Will, is it's a shock to read the news this morning that he's died. I mean, we all knew he had cancer, but he had done that podcast with David Coulthard not that long ago, and he did look very gaunt in the podcast, I must say, but he did give the impression that he was coming out the far side of it, and that, as he put it, he'd been through some dark times, but was coming out of those dark times. And what strikes me is Eddie was the youngest 76-year-old I ever knew. I mean, he dressed in a very young fashion. He behaved in a young fashion. He had a great young sense of humor. So, even the thought that he was 76 doesn't really tally with your experience of the man. But I go way back to when he was driving Formula Atlantic and that. And I always remember there wasn't just so much cynicism in Ireland towards him when he said he wanted to put an Irish team in F1. There was sarcasm. You'd hear so many people in Irish motorsport make comments like, yeah, Eddie Jordan's going to have an F1 team. He still owes me for a set of tyres. This type of begrudging stuff. And no one really took him seriously. And I have a vivid memory of just about 1 month before Jordan GP's opening race in F1, which was at Phoenix, Arizona. This was in 91, so this would be about February. He appeared on Kenny Live, the TV program. And there were 4 guests on that night. I know Ken Doherty was one. There was a very staunch feminist writer was another. I don't know who the third one was. And Eddie was the 4th. And the style of the program was, as the credits rolled, Pat Kenny would read out messages from viewers, usually quite complimentary, about their guests. There was no message about Jordan. There were messages for the other 3 guests. There was nothing about Jordan. This is 1 month before he went into a sport where he needed a minimum budget of £20 million to go in. But nobody really was taking him seriously at the time. And he was so conscious of that because he was incredibly proud of his Irishness. And all through his F1 career, that pride was reflected in the Enterprise Ireland logo on the car. In fact, even to the extent of when Martin Donnelly had his horrific crash at Jerez in qualifying for the Spanish Grand Prix, I think it was in 1990. And Eddie was Donnelly's manager because he did both managing drivers and the F1 team at that stage. And Donnelly suffered horrific injuries and never did make it back to F1. But Jordan said categorically that he wanted Donnelly back in an F1 car, a Jordan car, because he wanted the team as much as possible to be seen as an Irish team. The Jordan F1 car was designed by Gary Anderson from Coleraine. It was tested in all its infancy by John Watson from Belfast. And Jordan made the point that 20% of his workforce were Irish. This is the whole passionate nationalism of the man without a political aspect to it. So he was hugely proud of that Irishness and of going in amongst the big guns of F1 with an Irish team. And it took him a long time to get the people to understand and believe. And eventually RTE were covering their F1 races live. And he became this mega figure in probably the most glamorous sport in the world.
It's funny to me, though, you mentioned there, like the Irish connections to the team, the fact that we're such a sporting mad country, that he didn't receive, full-throated support from the get-go, because he subsequently became such a kind of popular figure among people, like this kind of cool figure on F1 analyst TV, in his later stage of life when he was on these far-flung locations. Very popular guy, but it's just interesting to hear your kind of knowledge from the time when it wasn't like that.
But I think it's a very Irish thing, Will, that we have this people left to their own devices. We see it a lot with track and field athletes, for example, having amateur coaches and having very threadbare facilities, but then they go and win a medal and there's a political overflow at the airport to greet them, and there's a media overflow. There's a late show appearance. We all react to success, but we don't really kind of support the build up to that success. And very much in 1991, as I say, it was more sarcasm than anything towards Eddie.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. Just to give people a little more insight into his backstory before he set up his F1 team, he got his kind of motorsport start, I guess, karting. That was his first kind of, launch pad. He won the Irish Karting Championship in 1971, progressed to Formula 3 as a driver, but suffered a bad crash in 1976 that set him on a path, I guess, more towards team ownership and kind of being a team principal. He founded Jordan Racing in 1979, and during the 80s built that team up in Formula 3 and F3000, and then eventually, as Vincent kind of outlines there, took the plunge into Formula 1. And it's funny, no one gave him a chance, I guess, to start, but it was only, I think, was it 4 races in that he accrued his first points, a 4th and 5th place finish for his 2 drivers, which was kind of a fascinating rise so quickly in a sport where he came in as a novice.
It was an incredible rise, and a lot of credit for that must go to Gary Anderson, who designed the car, this genius from Coleraine. Because from the get-go, the Jordan car was competitive, even with a Hart engine. And the big breakthrough then was when Peugeot came on board with the Peugeot engine, because their budget for that engine was something like 50 million compared to 5 million for Hart engines. And Ron Dennis, the head of McLaren at the time, he said it when Jordan got the Peugeot engines. Because there was a big 4 in F1. There was McLaren, there was Williams, there was Benetton, there was Ferrari. And Ron Dennis said it when Jordan got the Peugeot engines, there's going to be a big 5 now because Jordan is definitely going to take us all on.
Yeah, excuse me. And it was such an incredibly fast rise. And, was the initial skepticism was that wiped away with that early success? Or did it take another few years for people to really appreciate what Eddie was doing in Formula 1?
I think it was wiped away fairly quickly, because when you have a competitive car and the car starts winning points, and then you had the story of Michael Schumacher, who he put Michael Schumacher into F1 and believed that he said subsequently Michael lied to him because Michael hadn't signed the contract and of course was gone to Benetton 1 race later. He qualified 7th in a Jordan, and what you call the guy Flavio Briatore at Benetton said, "I'll have him," and the rest was history. But I think people copped on fairly quickly. I mean, if you bear in mind, by '98 they had the 1-2 at the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, and by '99 Frentzen was a late contender to actually win the World Drivers' title. So people cottoned on to it fairly quickly that Eddie might have been the joker and the social animal, if you like, but he was deadly serious about his F1 business, and you could see it too. He had a kindred spirit in Bernie Ecclestone. Bernie Ecclestone could be a very dismissive man of a lot of people in F1, but he listened to Jordan because Jordan had a candor about him and a bluntness to him when it came to business. And as he said himself, he was cutthroat in business. He would do anything to get a deal over the line. So he had those 2 sides to him: the joker, the fellow with always the smart, funny line that made him such a good pundit with the BBC subsequently. But he was deadly in a business context, and all of the big heads in F1, they came to realise that pretty quickly.
Yeah, you mentioned Michael Schumacher there, and being the guy who gave him his first race is a pretty kind of interesting thing to have in your CV. We're just going to play a clip of Eddie Jordan talking subsequently to that race, so right after that words about how it came about.
We needed at very short notice to get a replacement for Bertrand, who was obviously unavailable. Schumacher was available this weekend. He had no other commitments. I've seen him in Formula 3, and I have this, or the team has this attitude to give youth a chance. We think it's a progressive way to see what the potential of Schumacher is for the future.
So Michael Schumacher was one driver he obviously gave a start to, and as you outlined there, it didn't end in the best circumstances, but I think I saw him subsequently say that he got £1 million out of it in the end, so at least the coffers benefited to a degree. But it wasn't just Schumacher. He seemed to have an eye for talent like Rubens Barrichello, Eddie Irvine, guys like that kind of on the rise in their career. He was able to bring in, have success with. I think Barrichello got his first ever podium for Jordan Racing. And then I suppose once they did leave, though, he was able to maybe get a deal done that at least he wasn't left financially wanting.
Yeah, I think that was the smartest thing he did, Will, was to get into managing drivers. And he could spot talent from a mile off. And he was responsible for getting those drivers you mentioned into F1. And the deals that would get these drivers into F1 were always big money deals, and Eddie would get his cut from that. So he started making his money mainly from that originally. And that was what gave him the ability to even consider having his own team in F1. The one thing that I will always give him credit for, I was probably one of those journalists who believed in him from the get-go. And I did a lot of interviews with him when he was talking about getting into F1. And I knew that there was this huge skepticism around him. But once he was in F1, if you showed your face at a race, he couldn't have been more welcoming into the garage, into the motorhome. And I'll always remember in 1995, I went to the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola. It was 1 year after Ayrton Senna's death. And I wanted to get an interview with Eddie Irvine, who was driving for Eddie Jordan at the time. But I knew it was going to be very difficult because Eddie Irvine's best friend in F1 was Roland Ratzenberger. And he was killed on the Saturday at Imola in 94. And I knew Eddie Irvine would not want to talk about that awful weekend. But it was the obvious thing to talk about 1 year later, going back and going down to Tamburello Corner and that. And Jordan, because I'd been good to him when he was trying to get into F1, insisted on Irvine talking to me. And I had this very uncomfortable interview with Irvine in a Bologna hotel. I think it was the Thursday or the Friday before the Grand Prix. And he could be very spiky and very challenging in an interview. And he was certainly challenging that day. But when I thought about it afterwards, I was probably very unfair to expect Eddie Irvine to talk about Roland Ratzenberger, Senna, that weekend, when he was going back to that place to try and race that weekend. And I said it to him subsequently, I apologized to him, but he only did it because Jordan said, you've got to look after that guy. And that's what Eddie always did. And the last time I met Eddie was, I was at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. It was 2012 or 2013, I'm not sure which. And I was actually working as a marshal. I was pit entry marshal that day. And as the race ended, I was walking down the pit lane and Eddie comes walking up towards me and he stops in his tracks. And in typical Eddie fashion, he says, "What the fuck are you doing here?" That was Eddie all over, pure irreverence.
It's funny you tell that anecdote because I was about to read you an extract from Andrew Benson, the BBC's motorsport correspondent, a piece he wrote about Eddie today, and I wanted to get your take on it. Is this the individual that you knew? He says, rising to wealth and notoriety at a time when motorsport was kind of a wild west featuring many characters and deal makers, Jordan's outspoken, over-the-top personality stood out. He was a rogue who was sometimes lovable, sometimes dodgy, and occasionally both at the same time. Jordan's arrival in a location would commonly be marked by hearing a Dublin accent, yelling across a crowd at someone, launching an expletive-laden rant full of insults backed by a smile. The worse it sounded, the more it was an indication of his respect for the recipient. Does that ring true to you?
I think so. You couldn't but like Eddie Jordan. And he had that personality. He literally lit up a room when he walked into it. He was irreverent. He was mischievous. He was a rogue. But he was a deadly serious businessman as well. And you think of characters in sport, like Eddie Jordan was right up there in the biggest, probably most intimidating sport imaginable. And it's so shocking to think he's gone because, as I said earlier, he was so young at heart. And I think that's why people really warmed to him. He never acted his age and he never wanted to act his age.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if you've watched any of Drive to Survive. It obviously is a cultural phenomenon, and some of the team principals in particular, Gunther Steiner, Christian Horner, have become the breakout stars. You can't help but wish that it was around when Eddie Jordan was in the pit lane, because he seems tailor-made for that kind of Netflix style behind-the-scenes documentary.
Absolutely, he would have been a superstar in Drive to Survive. I mean, I think F1, it was a genius move by F1 to allow Netflix have access to all areas, and they have such a multitude of new fans for the sport because of the access. And some of the times Gunther Steiner and Haas, a team battling at the bottom of the grid. It's fascinating, it's compelling, it's brilliant to watch. In many ways, Eddie Jordan was Drive to Survive before that because he was such a colourful character. He gave that colour to F1 at a time it really wasn't there from the Ron Dennises or the Frank Williamses. Eddie Jordan gave it that colour. And I think because of the greyness of the sport in recent years, it has needed the Netflix boost and it has needed the Drive to Survive series to bring it to life.
Yeah, you mentioned, I suppose, the financial backing you needed to join F1 initially, and you had the kind of the throwaway line that someone had said to you about, oh, like, how can he go into F1? He owes me for, tires from back in the day. Going to play another clip for you about Eddie talking about the financial risks that were involved with what he was doing in Formula One and to get to the level he got to.
I took obscene risks because my mind was so convinced that I could pull this off. I would take as much of a loan I could out of there, and I could take this, and I would spend that and promise the people I'd pay, and eventually everyone got paid. But, the time frame was perhaps different to what they would have liked. But nevertheless, I got away with absolute murder.
So that was Eddie Jordan, I suppose, summing up, some of the financial, as he said, risks to take. Because even when I was reading about the Michael Schumacher race earlier, I think when Michael arrived at the pit lane, the two cars were impounded. That he was meant to, one of them was he was meant to be driving that day, so he had to do kind of a whip round with Bernie Ecclestone to be able to get them released. But it shows that to get to F1 is one thing, to stay in F1 is another thing, and to finance the whole beast is probably another thing entirely that we don't really see even in the Netflix show quite as much.
Yeah, I mean, he had balls of steel. That's what I'd say about him as a businessman. I mean, that first season in 91, you needed a budget, as I say, of 20 million minimum to be on the grid. I think Jordan lost 10 million that season, despite finishing fifth in the Constructors' Championship. Now, you think of, how do you sleep at night when that's all happening? You're going to lose your house. But he had that conviction that if he just stuck with it and he got the drivers he wanted and he got the backing he wanted, that Jordan GP would be a really lucrative package. Now, this is a guy who initially raced out of I think it was a pig shed in Silverstone. And then he built this state-of-the-art factory where Aston Martin are based now. And honest to God, to be in that factory in the mid-90s, it was breathtakingly spectacular. Wind tunnels, everything. You just think of the expense of having to build that facility when he was taking all these gambles. It could have blown up in his face at any time. And as he says himself, he took gambles that, from his family's perspective, were probably slightly unforgivable at the time. But he went for it. And happily, it all worked out for him.
Yeah, he eventually sold his team, I think in January 2005, for around €60 million, which obviously subsequent to that, he got into the Punditry as well, which I'm sure paid well. So I think in an interview we did with Paul Kimmage, maybe I think it was for his 70th birthday, maybe, so 6-7 years ago, he was, I think, living a comfortable life in his own words, and one that was quite exotic as well, with all the locations of an F1 race. And Vincent, I found it interesting, even up to recent months when he would have been suffering badly from cancer, he was still involved in some of the biggest deals in the sport. Like race engineer Adrian Newey joins Aston Martin from Red Bull, one of the key kind of behind the scenes figures in racing, and apparently Eddie Jordan was centrally involved in those negotiations. Yeah. It's remarkable that he was still, I suppose, so highly thought of that he would be in these kind of big level talks.
Yeah, just ask yourself, why was he managing Newey? Because Newey trusted him, and Newey knew he would get the best deal imaginable. I think it was something like a £20 million deal for Newey to move from Red Bull to Aston Martin. And it was to Eddie Jordan he went to. He said, can you do the deal for me? And he got a brilliant deal. I mean, Eddie was good at nearly everything he did. I mean, even his punditry, he was so straight talking. And, he was watching, for example, Lewis Hamilton in his final year at Mercedes last season. And Hamilton was out-qualified by George Russell in 15 or 16 times. He was just blown off the track by Russell. And Eddie said, if I was Ferrari, I'd cancel the contract for 2025 because he's lost his edge. He would have been regularly meeting Hamilton in the pit lane and that. He didn't care. If he saw something and he sees a driver losing his edge, he was going to say that. So he was a brilliant pundit as well as a brilliant manager.
And even the straight talkingness or the vulnerability he showed in talking about his cancer diagnosis, as you referred to earlier, like it was such a raw moment and an important message he was trying to put out to people as well, like get things checked, especially for men who might be more reluctant to do it on occasion. It was, if that's one of his legacies that he leaves, it's a pretty good one as well.
Absolutely. And here was a guy, by the way, who lived a very healthy lifestyle, was always running early in the morning. You give this impression because you're a drummer in a band called Eddie and the Robbers, and there's this party vibe at the end of Grand Prix races and that. But I can't think of another guy I've met in sport outside of the actual players who looked after himself better. He was impeccably turned out all the time, and as I say, impeccably dressed. That's what's so shocking about today's news. You just didn't think that was going to happen.
Yeah, certainly very jarring for people. You mentioned earlier the moment when Jordan achieved their first win and it ended up being a 1-2, Damon Hill first, Ralph Schumacher second. Was that greeted in Ireland with like kind of euphoria? Was it like front page news? Like by the time 1998 comes around and this win is achieved, what, year 8 of his F1 tenure, had people really kind of grown to respect him massively as a sporting figure in Ireland? Was this kind of real mainstream stuff?
It was. At that stage, definitely was, Will. I mean, bear in mind, RTE were showing the races live, and there was always this thing about Jordan cars that they were beautiful. I mean, the 7-Up car was a beautiful looking car, and at that stage then in the 90s, he had the Benson and Hedges backing it with the yellow livery. And I always remember at one stage there were these kind of shark's teeth painted into the side of the car. That when they had the 1-2 at Spa, that would have been front page news here, absolutely.
And was he still accessible? You know, I suppose when he was at that level, you mentioned that you would have had access to, earlier in the, down the pit lane, kind of into the motorhome and chatting to him. Was he still someone you were able to interview or seek out at a big event and chat to, or had by then, I suppose, had the mechanisms of Formula One kind of surrounded him a bit?
I suspect the mechanisms would have made him more difficult to get to. Now, I didn't really have much involvement with him subsequently, and bear in mind, he left F1 as a team owner in 2005. It's 20 years ago. Subsequent to that, I think he spent a lot of his time in South Africa. So I wouldn't really have sought him out that often, but any time I did, you'd go through his secretary and he would always come back to you. But I'm sure for a lot of journalists trying to contact him in the last 20 years, it was challenging. I'd say you had no easy job getting him to sit down with you.
Do you know, it's funny, you just mentioned there, it's 20 years since he left the sport. Like, he would have still been very prevalent in his media personality, obviously being on TV. But I guess it's kind of a shame almost it takes his death for people to kind of hark back to his actual achievements on the track. We would have heard him speak, and as you mentioned, giving great analysis and, very straight analysis, which we like. But it's kind of nice to also be able to reflect on his achievements on the track too.
Yeah, and I think it's nice to reflect on the scale of his achievement and to get into Formula One and be one of Formula One's most colourful, most successful figures over a long period of time. Was a huge achievement. And he came from a generation of Irish racing drivers like David Kennedy, Vivian Candy, who had a very strong belief in their own ability and a very strong belief of the possibility of an Irish team being in F1. That was something that outsiders would have looked at and said it was utterly absurd. But that group of people would have said, no, this is possible with Enterprise Ireland backing. And there was always Chorus Truchtala, for example, stickers on cars that they raced. And they were always pushing that envelope to get government backing for an Irish F1 team. People laughed at it, and they were still laughing 1 month before he went to that grid in Phoenix, Arizona. But they weren't laughing soon after.
Yeah, just to play one more clip for you, it's Eddie reflecting on what he thinks maybe the legacy of what he did with Jordan Racing is.
I think what Jordan showed, I believe, was that we'd won Formula 4 championships, we'd won Formula 3 championships, Johnny Herbert, and then John Alessi won the 3000 championships. So we had a bit of a history. We had, in our DNA, we had a belief that we could deliver. And I think we hopefully would have inspired a lot of young teams, even to this day, that, hey, you can come into Formula One, you can defy all the odds, you can actually grab it by the horns and say, we are going to do everything we can to be competitive. Because for sure, Jordan finishing 5th in its first season in the championship, that was a very big statement.
Yeah, Vincent, it's not as if any team can rock up and compete and win races, but he did pave the way or show that you can be an underdog at least and compete with the big boys.
Yeah, but I would say is that I can't think of another F1 team that was so defined by its owner. And, the encouragement he's saying there to young teams that they can do this. Well, maybe you can if you have a real maverick figure like an Eddie Jordan who will go brazenly where nobody's gone before. I can't see that happening now. I think you've such monstrous budgets involved. He did it at a time when just sheer force of personality could get you through so many doors. I'm not sure that happens now, but I'm not sure there's another Eddie Jordan out there anyway, Will.
I don't think there could ever be another Eddie Jordan. I think the word maverick you use there is certainly apt. Just before we finish up then, like, I suppose, how will you remember Eddie Jordan now, in years to come, when his sad passing is a few years on and his name pops up, or you see a clip of his punditry or his racing time with Jordan is mentioned? What will kind of the memory be for you?
I'll remember him with a smile, because he just would make you smile. He had that Irish warmth, that Irish humour, that pride in where he came from, but also a kind of unnatural self-confidence, because as Irish people, but generally we don't communicate that when we go into this place of superstars and superstar budgets. We tend to be a little bit, I think, tentative and maybe deferential in environments like that as Irish people. He was the polar opposite, and that's why he got through so many doors, because he said, I'm here and I'm here to stay.
Well, it was an incredible life, and thank you so much for helping us remember him today.
Pleasure, Will.